Hey everyone, welcome back to Shutter Magazine. I'm Dustin Lucas, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the top 10 tips for beginners in Lightroom Classic. So, little backstory on how long I've been working in this program, little less than a decade. I've seen quite a few changes in the program, and I'm constantly learning and open to learning new things in Lightroom. So if you're a beginner to Lightroom, maybe you're opening a new business or you've been working in photography for a while, you've likely come across Lightroom. It can be a daunting tool at first, but it's really important to kind of simplify things in terms of creating a plan, making a workflow. You're going to hear that term used a lot. What the hell does a workflow mean, right? You just basically need to put a plan together. How are you going to use the program? How are you going to store your files? How are you going to back up your files? What kind of presets are out there? Editing, all this stuff that's out there to kind of make making a workflow or using the program just really seem daunting. So what I've put together here are the top 10 tips if it's your first time using Lightroom, how to use the different modules, and some quick ways to get working in Lightroom. So let's jump into the top 10 tips. All right, so tip number one is going to be catalog management. So what does that mean? What's a catalog, right? So Lightroom is a digital asset manager, which means it's going to take all your digital files and it's going to manage them. So Lightroom is based on a cataloging system. So you're going to hear that word catalog used a lot, which is required. You have to create a catalog to open your pictures into Lightroom. So typically when you create a catalog, it's called Lightroom Catalog, really fancy name, right? But you can create catalogs, you can make multiple catalogs, or you can work in a single catalog, which I recommend doing. It's called a master catalog. Everything you shoot specifically for a year should come into that catalog. It should be in one place so you can manage everything together. Now you might hear people talk about creating catalogs per event, which is fine, but I think that's a lot of catalogs to manage, especially when you're getting started. It's easier to have all of your files import. That means that's how you have to open them into Lightroom. You have to bring them into Lightroom by importing them, and that's how you're able to work on those files. So it's very important you have your catalogs stored on a local hard drive, right? So you can have them on your desktop or documents or pictures, that's fine. You do not want these on an iCloud drive. You do not want them on external drives. You want your catalogs to be local on the fastest, more than likely a flash storage or solid state drive, very important, so it's running its fastest. But you always want to have your raw files on an external hard drive. That's important, right? So separation of church and state. You want your catalog local, you want your raw files external hard drive. It's the best way to set things up. Now, in Lightroom, you're also going to want to back up your files, right? So you're probably going to hear a lot about, backup management plans for your raw files, right? You want to have two on-site backups or two versions, copies of the files on-site, and you want to have one off-site, right? It's the 2-1 rule, right? So what's important is doing the same thing with your catalogs. So to jump into the catalog settings, we can hold Option, Command, comma, and we can pull up catalog settings. Now, every time you close Lightroom, typically it's always on when Lightroom exit, every time exit, never. I like to have backup go pop up every time that I exit Lightroom. So that way when I quit the program, I can choose to specifically back this catalog up in real time. Now what's going to be important is you do not want to back this catalog up only to your local hard drive, right? So if your local hard drive has your original catalog and your backup catalog and your computer breaks or hard drive crashes or for whatever reason computer gets stolen, you just lost all of your editing data, which is kind of stupid, right? You don't want to have your backups in the same place. So what you want to do is you want to choose, I prefer a cloud drive. So I have my Google Drive connected in a local folder and I have all my backups going there. So I just choose that and then click backup, and it's going to run a copy of this catalog to my Google Drive, and it's already syncing that file online, right? So that's important to do. Now, you could always have it go to an external hard drive as well. That's just fine. You could have that with your raw files, but it's important to make sure it's not on the same hard drive only as your backup. It kind of defeats the purpose. Let's jump into tip number 2. All right, so tip number 2 is going to be importing and building smart previews. So to get your files into Lightroom, you have to import them, right? So the most important thing in this stage is to set up part of your workflow, and that's going to be taking the files from your memory cards and saving them to a hard drive, right? It seems pretty simple. You can do it in Finder, you can use different programs, you can even use your camera software to do it. Or you can let Lightroom do it, right? So if you want to come in directly from a memory card into Lightroom, you can, and likely the copy option is going to pop up for you. So on the left-hand side here, you'd have your memory cards, your different sources, right, where your files are coming from. There's a quicker option called Add, which just adds the images into Lightroom, right? So it's just going to reference them from the source that they already are in, right? So it just depends on how you want to bring these files in. So of course, if you are bringing the files in from a memory card, you're gonna have to copy them, right? Nobody's gonna work from a memory card and just add them, right? You need to copy them to an external hard drive. Now you'd have a destination drive that would pop up here, right? You'd have different external hard drives. You could do all of your file management here. You even have the ability to do backup from here, which I don't typically like using. I like to copy the files to one location, create my subfolders here, and then either I have a RAID drive, so multiple hard drives are already backing up, or I just copy at the end of the week the root folders, so that way everything is organized the same way in Lightroom. So what's important here, so I'm gonna go ahead and click on Add at the top here. You always want to choose either Add or Copy, of course, depending on if you're going from a memory card, but do not use Copy as a DNG. It's an old dinosaur way of bringing in files in a Lightroom. Might be offending some of those old school Lightroom users, but I don't really care. Copy as DNG is useless. So clicking on Add, we're going to go over here to the right hand side under File Handling, which is very important. Now your default settings might be set to Embedded in Sidecar, which isn't much of a useful option for building previews. I like to do minimal. I don't want any previews building on these raw files because it's going to take forever. We'll get to that in just a bit. I like to build smart previews, and I want those smart previews to build as soon as the files are done importing. So I'm going to go ahead and click Import. You're going to see my files are going to come in pretty quickly. Now I have them on my local drive, and you're probably rolling your eyes because I just said put your raw files on an external drive. This is just for a tutorial base and to kind of show the speed. Now if you had an external flash drive or an external solid state drive, of course it's going to be running way faster than a mechanical drive. So as we watch these smart previews build, I want to kind of show you the difference between having a raw file, and then next we're going to show you how to work on just your smart previews. So as you notice here, this selected file shows it as an original photo, which it is, but pretty soon you're going to start to see these images populate from here and fill this end up here. So that way we can have smart previews and originals for all of our files. So go ahead and click OK, and it's done, right? So as you notice here under your histogram, you're going to have showing originals plus smart previews. Now if you imported files and forgot to check that box, that's okay. You can always do it later under the library in the top menu bar, previews, build smart previews, all the same, right? And that is tip number 2. All right, so tip number 3 is going to be build previews before you're editing, right? So what I want to do since we built smart previews on these files is I want to disconnect the raw files from the catalog. So what we're going to do here is we're going to click on the originals, and we're going to right click and choose update folder location, and I'm going to trick Lightroom into thinking that the files are on the desktop. So now all of our files here are showing up as just smart previews. Now what's important about that is these files will run way faster as smart previews than they would as original raw files. So as I'm running through these files, I can now select them, go to library, choose previews, and build standard previews. Now standard previews are very important to build before editing, before you cull, because you want the previews that you're looking at here to be all generated before you're starting to go through the edits, because you're going to have to wait for them to load, right? So it's very important as we're running through these images that we wait for those standard previews to finish, right? So once that's done, then you would be ready to do your culling or your color correction or any kind of editing that you need to do. But you can see how much faster this is here as it's building those quite quickly. Normally it's building them a lot slower because it would be building them on the original files. And just to kind of show you the difference, right, if I select these and do update folder location, let's do update folder location to relink our files. Let's find where those files originally were saved. And I think they were saved not here. Let's go back to documents, Shutter Magazine. Here we go. So if I choose this and my originals are back, let's see if I can trick this into doing standard previews. Well, we don't want to build standard previews on all the files. I was kidding. Let's see, previews, build standard previews. Since those are already built, let's go ahead and do a quick develop to all the files and then apply standard previews. And it's going to run through those pretty quickly, considering we've had them built already with those adjustments. But you can see with the smart previews and having these disconnected, it's just a faster way. You can also disconnect your hard drive. That's an option as well. That would make the process a lot faster as well as it's rendering out those previews. And that is tip number 3. All right, so tip number 4 is going to be the quick develop panel. Now in Lightroom, there is a way for you to globally adjust your images at an incremental level. What does that mean, right? So if I were to sync all of these images here and just quickly sync them, I'd want to get them as kind of close as possible. Now I probably need to sync, let's see here, cancel, we'll make sure HSL, we'll just check all, turn off cropping and some of these other options here. Just kind of get them as close as possible. And it didn't really have too much to do there. Let's see here, 5800, that looks good. And then we'll sync those. Now, if I wanted to take all of these images and incrementally brighten them, right? Like if I had them at different values, let's see here, see if we can do that with this. It's going to take them in their settings. Let's brighten a few of these up a little bit more than the 0.15, right? So if we want to take these images and we want to globally brighten them up, we can click this arrow here and it's going to bring all of them up together, right? So it's not just going to copy those settings across them, as you see here. Let's find the one that I adjusted. Oh, let's see. For instance, if this image was at 0 and this one is at 0.48, if I globally brought those up, it's going to take this one to 0.81 and this one to 0.33, right? So it's adding a very specific increment of exposure, 0.33 specifically, right? So if I wanted these to, if I wanted to increase the brightness on these for half that value, I could hold Shift, click on that button, and it brightens them up just a little bit. I can also warm them up globally by hitting the right arrow, and I can make those adjustments to multiple images at once versus going into the develop module, right, editing each image individually and then syncing them, right, and then going to the next image, right? So it's just a quicker way to make global changes to images specifically. So if I liked the white balance of all these, but I just wanted to cool them down just a little bit, I can hit that left arrow under temperature and it's going to cool them all down incrementally, right? But you got to keep in mind, it's only going to bring them down an increment from where they were. So these were in much warmer edits than this one, right? So we'd want to make sure those images match across the board. As you can see, they're changing quite a bit, right? So you have your different images and your adjustments and things. So typically with the quick develop module, you want to understand the limitations of the tool, of course, but it does give you a pretty quick and global option to make adjustments to images. Same way with these, if we wanted to just brighten all of these up quickly, couple clicks of the mouse, and they're all brightened up. And then we can make even more incremental adjustments if we wanted to slightly brighten those up as well. And that is tip number 4. All right, so tip number 5 is going to be using lights out mode for culling. So for culling your images, you're going to want to look at them one at a time, and you're going to want to find the fastest way to run through these files to either cull out images or keep them, right? So that's the option. That's where culling comes from, culling out. So what I like to do is come down to a single image. I hold Shift, hit Tab, and that gives me full screen with my panels gone, right? And then I can click the L key twice. That puts me into lights out mode. And what I like with this mode is I can run through these images as fast as I need to, but I need focus. I need to make sure, no pun intended, that these images of course are sharp, but I want to make sure my focus and attention is on culling these images so I can get through it as fast as possible. Now you can hit the F key, which is a pretty quick way to run through full screen as well, right? It's going to make the images a little bit bigger, so they might need a little more time to render. But what is important when you're culling is I like to only see the images that I'm going to keep. I want any images I know that are garbage to be gone from my view. So another quick tip here for culling is I like to choose the option that's filter based on flag status. And so what I do during my culling is I only like to reject flag. So there are, just to back up here a little bit, there are attributes in Lightroom. There are flags, right? You have the pick flag, you have the unflag, and then you have the reject flag. So reject flags would be on images you definitely don't want to show. The pick flag would be on ones maybe you want to highlight. And no flags just mean it's probably good to show the customer, but it's probably a duplicate too. But you can also use ratings, star ratings, 1 through 5, and then you can also use the color ratings, right? I think red is 6, and then the rest of these kind of go up 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 with these first 4 colors here. But these are attributes in what you'll use to label your images to filter them. So what's important when you are culling is turning on that attribute. So if I hit the X key, you see how the image goes away from my view, which is very important. So when I'm culling in lights out mode, I want to apply reject flags to images I know I don't want. So here's how I'd run this process. I don't have to hit anything else other than the X key and the right arrow. So if I hit the X key, it automatically advances to the next image, right? So I could go through all of these kind of beginning shots and quickly just remove them, right? So as I go through and I just get rid of images I definitely don't want, I can do that pretty quickly here, right? So then I can always just do undo if I accidentally reject one that I want to keep. So if I'm going through these images, right? Anything that you'd be doing with your own culling, and I can hit the F key, right? If I want to make it larger, that's fine too. And I'm just going through these images, right? Now I could zoom in on them, right? I don't necessarily need to. They look pretty sharp from the view. But remember, we don't have our original files connected, so we might not be able to get the one-to-ones, but we can at least get these images close enough. But as you see here, I'm just doing a quick pass to get rid of images I definitely don't want, like with eyes closed or unflattering expressions or just kind of, you know, in-between moments don't really make any sense. So I want to make sure to get rid of those. So the only images I have in my view are the ones that I'd actually be okay color correcting, editing. those are the ones that I want to make sure stay in view, and everything else just goes away, right? So it makes sense. We can hit L, actually we can hit F to get out of full screen mode and go back here. And of course, if we want to review our rejected files, we can. We can go back through them and just make sure there weren't any that we want to unreject, right? Then we just hit the U key if we accidentally wanted to keep it. And that's all. That's tip number 5. All right, so tip number 6 is going to be straightening on the fly. So as a photographer, we try and get the horizon line. We really try to get the images as straight as possible. Sometimes maybe our one leg's shorter than the other, or we're standing on a hill, or we're just not paying attention to that composition, right? Whatever the reason is, you can always fix it in post. Less work in post, of course, would always be ideal, but here's how to do it quite quickly. So with an image like this, we need some leveling done. We also need some of the perspective to be fixed. So my gut instinct is to go into the transform tool, which is in the develop module, and click on full. And that does a pretty good job, right, of just quickly fixing the skewed aspect and the leveling aspect all in one fell swoop. But that doesn't always work. Sometimes it misses the windowsill, sometimes it misses architectural elements and things like that, so it doesn't always work. You can also choose the level option, so we can kind of toggle this on and off, and it just does a quick level of the image. Now, if you want the ability to tweak this image fast and go through multiple images with straightening, I like to use the crop tool. So if I hit the R key, that immediately takes me into the cropping, and I can click the O key if I want to change my grid overlay here. Of course, if I want to get super crazy and have a lot of boxes here, but I think the thirds are fine. And I would choose an element that I want to straighten to. So if I wanted to use this part of the road here on the bottom, I'll hold Command, click, and drag across that. And that's going to straighten the image to that point. Now, of course, you want to make sure we're not cropping into the feet. We can choose Constrain to crop. You have different options here. I don't think this is the proper object to straighten to necessarily, but you have a few different ones, right? You can go vertical if you wanted to vertically straighten this, right? There's a few different options, but if you wanted to use the ground element, which is typically the case, that kind of gets you there. And to go to the next image, you're going to hold Command and hit right arrow. And we do the exact same thing, right? We go through all these images and just keep straightening them. Next image, straighten them. Next image, right? So I'm holding Command the entire time. Your finger will likely fall asleep during that process, but that's completely normal, right? All jokes aside, but as you're going through this process, it just takes a little finessing and figuring out what elements you want to use. If you want to use the architecture behind them to anchor the image and get it straightened versus the roadway, right? It's all up to you. You have this kind of horizon line back here that, might be something you want to straighten to as well, and just kind of keep it there. But that's tip number 6. All right, so tip number 7 is going to be reference mode. What is reference mode? Well, it's the specific view in the develop module that allows you to look at 2 images side by side while editing in develop. So to get into reference mode, we would hold shift and hit the R key. Now, any image that you want to make your reference image, or the image on the left here, you would just right click and choose set as reference photo. Now with the lock option in place, we don't have to worry about losing that image as our reference image. And what you can do is you can edit different images from throughout parts of the day, and you can always reference back to this first one that you edited. So what's important is when you are editing for your reference image, you want to find one that's open, more open air, or more kind of evenly lit. It has kind of the ideal colors in the background. And once you dial that in, then you can edit other parts of the day to match them. And it just makes it really simple to kind of make some samples and edit as more of a kind of divide and conquer method here, right? So if we wanted to go through these images and kind of match them, we could do that more easily in these different scenes. and just kind of dial them in. Now, of course, there's a preset applied on these, and I'd want to make sure they're as consistent as possible. So let's go ahead and sync those. Kind of brighten these images up here a little bit, but you kind of get the idea for reference mode. So it gives you the ability to look at images from other scenes and quickly match them. Drop that down. If we wanted to dial these in a little bit more. And that's basically it for the samples. Now, when I'm making samples, I would want to choose an image from the beginning of each sequence, right? So I make these in red, so that way I can make all of my samples. Let me show you those real quick. So I have these images pre-picked as my samples, and once I edit just those images to kind of match each other, then I can sync in those sequences, and it should be much faster to do my editing. And just sync those images from each sequence, right? And I would just do it here in grid mode, right? It's just a way for me to kind of get the images dialed in, and I could just sync all of those and keep running down the line. Now, as I'm going through and editing them, of course, I take them through develop mode. Maybe I want to make this image the reference image, so I'd have to unlock this so I could run through the rest of these images to start matching them. And that's it. All right, tip number 8 is going to be a quick run through of presets. When it comes to Lightroom, you are probably going to hear presets more than any other term, maybe even more than workflow. Presets are a way to save your previous settings to use in the future to make editing faster, right? So in the import module, you have the ability to create an import preset. So if you wanted to save your smart previews workflow, right, you could save it. If you wanted to do memory card and create a subfolder and do it by, have it import by date and have whatever options you wanted here to apply, you could have that set up as well. And you can have one-to-one previews, whatever you want, and you could create a new preset called, memory card, right? Doesn't really matter. You have these different options and you'd automatically choose them, and it would just know what you need to do, right? Pretty quick, pretty handy for importing. Now in develop, of course, whether you've purchased presets, made them yourself, doesn't really matter. But if you're editing and you find kind of that you have this like pattern to editing, you might want to save that as a preset. So if I take this image back to its kind of origins here, you might want to apply some contrast, drop the highlights, shadows, black point. You might want to have very specific adjustments that you want done, on multiple images here. Raise that, lower this down. We can bring, if whether you've made one or not, it doesn't really matter. Just kind of showing you how we can quickly run through this. Maybe we want lens correction turned on, all that kind of stuff. So if we want this to be a preset for our images, we'll add some vibrance. We can do that. Shift Command N, and we can create a new preset and just call this 02, 01 starting point. Golden warm. And we'd want to make sure to uncheck white balance and exposure, of course, but only check the options that we need. Of course, checking them all doesn't really matter in this moment. But if you wanted to, not have HSL adjusted, or you didn't want to have the detail and sharpening apply over the top, you could uncheck those settings specifically. But I'm going to go ahead and do that. And now we have this new preset saved here called Starting Point Golden Warm. Then we could apply it to all of our images when we start out, really simply by clicking here. And it's going to apply that preset to all our images instantly. And I'm going to undo it because these images are already edited, but you get the point. Now with exporting your images, right, original files are missing. So that option is going to pop up when you have to reconnect to your raw files. I'm going to skip that for now, but keep in mind when you're exporting files, you would need to reconnect those with the raw files. Now, I have these different presets set up for exporting. Instagram, Facebook, blog, different labs for print and things like that. So every time you fill these settings in and you're adjusting them very specifically for the output, what you're going to do with these images once they're done, you can add a preset. You can create subfolders, you can rename the preset, everything you need to do. You can even make changes if you want your Facebook quality to drop down to 80 and you want to resize to fit. Longest edge is 1200 at 150, right? We could right click and do update with settings, so that way when we come back to Facebook, they automatically apply. So presets from starting, import, while you're editing, develop, and when you're exporting, taking the images out of Lightroom, you can use these presets to save those settings and work faster. That is tip number 8. Okay, so here's tip number 9. Now you're likely going to rename the files that you select for your customer, you edit and want to deliver to them, right? There's nothing worse than sending the original names to your customer and they're wondering where all those files, right, between the ones that you chose are. So it doesn't matter if you shot 800 images for a session, but you only deliver 100 to your client. They're going to wonder where those other 700 images are if you use the original names. So I like to rename the files and I like to do it in Lightroom, and here's why. So before we can rename our files, you have to have them linked to the raw files. So we're going to update folder location and we are going to choose where the original raw files are. This is very important, right? You can't rename the raws unless they're connected. So now that we have our raw files connected, you can see that I've already renamed these, right? So if I select these files here and I go into the metadata tab and I click on the batch rename button, I can choose to rename my files. Now, in the event that you would want to revert your original files back to, you'd want to revert your renamed files back to the original name, you could do it pretty easily, right? So I'm going to kind of reverse engineer this and then we're going to build it back out. So as you see, my files are already renamed, but I can insert the original files back onto these, click OK, and the files go back. Now I could select all, click on the batch rename, and I can custom name these files whatever I want. So if I wanted them to be whatever my person's name was, what the shoot was, it was just a styled shoot. I also like to use underscores. I don't like to use spaces just because it's an illegal character with file naming, it's just out of habit. And then I want to insert a sequence, so it's automatically going to rename these files starting with 001. Go ahead and click done. Now before I do that, I want to show you these files in Finder right now are, right, the original names, okay? Take note of that. So as we select all, edit, and we insert that, you'll notice that those files changed in the folder as well. So it's very important to take note, whichever source folder you have here and wherever your raw files are, that's where they're going to be stored. Now I already have mine in the selected raws folder here, but what you can do is if you want to take these files and move them into a new folder, I highly recommend doing that inside the Lightroom catalog, because if you do it out here, right, if I do it in Finder, it's going to disconnect those files. So let's just call this underscore pics, right? And I want to take all these and move them into pics. Guess what's going to happen, right? The files are going to be missing. We no longer have the files here in our folder. So I'm going to go back into Finder and undo, put them back. Do you see the files moved back? It's very important to do this in Lightroom. So if you want to move these files, you want to create folders, do it in Lightroom. There's no reason not to, right? So I'm going to go ahead and click on Originals. We're going to show Parent Folder. And if I want to create a subfolder called _pics, I can. Now, selected folders are already included, but let's make sure that we only have those selected ones. Plus, add subfolder, and we're clicked on the parent folder. So if you create a subfolder here, it's going to put it inside this 09 September folder. So we're going to call this, let's see, 05 pics. Sure. Right? And so now, show in Finder, those files are here, and they're no longer in the abyss of the original folder. So it actually moves them, which is important to know, right? It doesn't copy them. And that is the best way to do it. So that way your files are in Lightroom. You're letting Lightroom manage those files because it's a database. That's what it does. And it doesn't, and then it won't be disconnected from the files where they're at in the Finder folder. So that's tip number 9. All right, so tip number 10 is going to be learning your shortcuts and hotkeys, right? So this is not something you're going to learn overnight. It's going to take countless hours in Lightroom, memorization, and just writing down the frequently used shortcuts that you use, put them on a post-it note, stick them on your computer so that way you can learn them, right? It's like anything you do in school, it's a practical knowledge. You have to practice it over and over and over again to get it stuck in your head. So in the library module, if you hold Command, this is your first hotkey, and the / key, here are all of your Lightroom shortcuts. We do not need to go through them, but the biggest ones that I use are grid mode. I use the lights out mode, which we talked about, your rating shortcuts, also known as attributes, and things like that. So you can do the same thing by hitting the D key, another shortcut to get into develop mode, holding Command, clicking the / key, and here are all of your develop shortcuts, right? Converting to black and white, your different ratings which pop up as well. You have your sync settings, so something as useful as the sync settings. If you want this to pop up in a hotkey, Shift Command S, that's a good one. And there are a multitude of different ones. We talked about the reference mode, Shift R, we talked about the crop tool, and all those kind of things. So this is something that you want to really get familiar with to speed up that process. Now, what's really cool about, at least on Apple systems, I'm not sure how easy this is to do on a PC. I apologize for those PC users that are probably rolling their eyes, as every tutorial I do is on a Mac. It's just what I use. It's a tool I use. So you can create your own hotkeys, which is pretty cool. So one of the earlier tips, we talked about making standard previews. And as you notice, standard previews typically doesn't have this hotkey here. Now I created one so it's popped up, but I'm going to go into my system preferences and show you how to create your own hotkey. So you go into the keyboard module, you go to shortcuts, and as you see here under app shortcuts, I created my own. Now if I remove it, of course, it's going to be gone, and we're going to go ahead and quit Lightroom, and I'm going to show you on how to make one specifically for your standard previews. Because I'm building standard previews, forcefully building those standard previews all the time. So instead of having to go up here in library, previews, see, my hotkey's gone. I can't do the hotkey. It won't build the standard previews. So we have to open up keyboard, and we're going to click plus, and I'm going to choose Lightroom Classic, and you have to plug in the exact menu title or what it's referred to as in the Lightroom window. So as we go here, we have to type in build standard sized standard sized previews. That's what you have to type in. So as we go here, build standard sized previews, we want to make sure that matches. Build standard sized previews. It's exactly what we need to have. Now in the keyboard shortcut, you literally type in what the keyboard shortcut should be. So in my mind, I'm thinking, previews. I better use the P key, but I can't use Command P because that's print, and any other kind of versions of that. So, and I want to manually do this pretty quickly. So I'm going to choose Shift, Option, Command, P. That's going to be my hotkey for building standard size previews. Now, once I relaunch Lightroom, I will now have that option to build standard previews. I hold Shift, Option, Command, P, and it builds standard previews. So now it's going to do that very fast. So I do Shift, Option, Command, Shift, Option, Command, P, right? And it's automatically going to build that, and it will also show up here. So it's a pretty awesome tip if you want to build your own shortcuts for any other features that you use specifically. A lot of the tools and different functions in Lightroom already have hotkeys or shortcuts. But so there's any of these other ones that you want to create shortcuts for, that's how easy it is, and that is tip number 10. All right, so now on for the results. So I'm hoping that you got a lot of takeaways from these tips, right? Whether you're a beginner to photography or not, if this is your first time learning Lightroom, this is going to be a lot of information. So the beauty of having a video or going through my article is these are step by step. So there's a lot of kind of micro tips within the top 10 tips for beginners in Lightroom Classic, but trust me, take the time to learn the program. It's slow season for most of us. It's a good time of year to learn this tool. It is going to save you countless hours. So if you have friends or colleagues that are using Bridge and Camera Raw, Lightroom is the supercharged child of those two programs. It just runs way better, but you have to understand the limitations of Lightroom, how to use Lightroom the most efficiently, and you won't have problems, right? So it's very important to read up on system requirements, buy the right computer, buy the right hardware. Of course, that's going to help. You want to buy fast external storage, have your your Lightroom catalog on a local hard drive. All those things are going to matter. Above all, when you get started, make a plan, make a workflow, write it out. What are you going to do when you're done with the shoot? How are you taking those images from your memory card to your hard drives? How are you going to back up? You want to fill your workflow in with the entire scope of what you're going to do with your files. You need to manage those files. Lightroom is just a piece of that puzzle, right? So it's very important to get that put together before you dive into Lightroom. Hope you guys enjoyed these top 10 tips. Tune in next month for more.